I watched this movie around the time where I was watching a lot of foreign films and I was getting to a lot of different foreign filmmakers, and certain names kept popping up: Kurosawa, Tarkovsky. This was definitely one of those names that popped up there. And I knew he had a very artistic filmography. It was a little scary trying to get into it because of that. At the time, probably in my early 20s. So I was prepared to, I'm going to be reading subtitles, I'm going to be watching something from a different culture. So I tried to stay as open minded as possible. I didn't know if I was really going to fully buy into him. This was to me the most accessible of the Bergman films because it looked kind of gothic, it looked like a horror movie. It's kind of like that Scandinavian folk horror type feel to it. So this was the first Bergman film I gave a chance to. And this kind of opened me up for like the lesser accessible films like Wild Strawberries and The Virgin Spring. And lo and behold, speaking of horror movies, The Virgin Spring was turned into a classic horror film as well. It's a movie that explores religion and faith and things like that, things that I'm not really into. And the fact that it's black and white artistic film, it's not a film that I would anticipate liking, but I loved it. I still loved it with this viewing, not as much as the first viewing, I do have to admit. In my mind, there was more between death and the night. That game of chess, it's so vivid in your mind because it's so strange and unique and it's been parodied so much. You think it's more of the film than it is. And it's been so long since I've seen it. I was kind of disappointed like how little of the film it actually took up. But those were my initial thoughts on this rewatch. What about yourself?
Well, that's interesting. I have a kind of a similar experience in that I had never seen any Bergman films, and I was young. I was probably 18, 19, and I was taking a film studies class, and they showed The Seventh Seal. And I actually loved it. I thought it was great. It made a huge impression on me. I watched it again. Um, but it didn't really lead me to explore Bergman's filmography. And I have to admit that this is an area that I'm kind of weak on. I haven't seen very many of his other films. I've seen this one more than once, and maybe Wild Strawberries, and I think I've seen one or two that he wrote and didn't direct, oddly enough, because they just came to me at some point. But I really haven't made a point of exploring the filmography. But this movie, I think, is great, and I hear what you're saying about the game of chess, because that's one of the things that, of course, really made an impression on me and really stuck with me. And you're right. There's only about three scenes where they actually do that in the movie. It is a bit surprising because it makes such a huge impression and really sticks in your mind. Um, but I also think one of the reasons it appealed to me was it's kind of like a horror film in a way, like it kind of is. I mean, it's got death as a character, and there's moments in it like the reveal of the dead body of the dead monk. When they reveal that, that's pretty shocking. You don't expect it, and then boom, it's kind of like a scare moment. And I'm sure that audience members probably screamed back in the day when this movie first came out. It's a great moment that kind of anticipates other movies like Psycho, where they suddenly reveal a body to you, and it's a real shock. But also, one of my favorite subplots of it, I guess, is the stuff with the witch, or the woman who's accused of being a witch, and that stuff really stuck with me as well. And there's something very horrific about that. And certainly, witchcraft and witches being burned at the stake is something you see in quite a few horror films. So all in all, it feels related to horror, even though it's not a horror film exactly. But it definitely, especially the classic black and white horror films, I think this kind of fits in fairly well with that. And maybe the reason I didn't explore many of his other films is they don't look as much like horror to me. But I certainly know people who love some of his other films and have told me, you've got to see this film. And I keep saying, yes, I will. But yeah, so far it's really all about the Seventh Seal for me.
hmm Yeah, this is an interesting blend of horror and art house because it does remind you of Psycho type movie, those black and white, 1950s movies. And it also kind of reminds you of the other like artsy movies from the 50s that the kind of low budget period piece movies, Macbeth by Orson Welles and Othello by Orson Welles and The Trial by Orson Welles. I'm sure there are other filmmakers, but it just so happens that the first three movies that popped into my head from that general time frame are all Orson Welles films. But there were a lot of arty type period film movies in the 50s that this kind of remind me of, because you're right, it is a blend of horror with period drama. I don't think this is trying to be necessarily historically accurate. I'm not much of a historian, but I don't think realism was a big part of this film. And I don't know if it's necessarily a big thing that Bergman preoccupies himself with, because I think one of the filmmakers that he mentions in interviews that he admired was Tarkovsky. And Tarkovsky was, films are dreams, and he edits them in a dreamlike way. With Bergman, I think it's all about emotion and feel and having these philosophical debates about religion and different things like that. I don't think these characters talk like people normally would talk. I don't think the actors act in a realistic type manner. Soliloquies and speeches, and almost like Charlton Heston in the Ten Commandments. Because it's a period piece, we're like, oh, that's just how people were back then. No one, people back then were just like normal people. They had regular conversations. They used different words of the time, but I think people excuse that type of acting because you can get away with a period drama. And especially when you're talking about religion and big themes like that, the more bombastic themes, it's like your actors have to act that way. Everything is larger than life with their performances. The timeline, either he wanted to get the themes of the Black Death, the plague, the Crusades, and the witch hunting stuff, but I don't think those overlapped in any type of a way. I think the Crusades was probably first, then the Black Death, and then I think the witch hunting stuff, I think that lasted the longest of those three. I could be wrong, but I don't think they overlapped. But they all had themes of like dread and death and what happens after you die, and questioning everything. And I think that's what the night represents, is just questioning all this stuff during such horrific times. And artistically, I think it helped to overlap all three of those things rather than just focusing on one, because it made the film seem so much more dire and a bunch of other adjectives that I can't think of right now. It added to that dread, that feeling of dread, that I think enhanced these debates that these characters would have, and the presence of death. I think all of that kind of enhanced the themes. I don't think it's very realistic though, but I don't knock it because it was very intentional.
Yeah, for sure. And Bergman was a theater guy, right? He directed a lot of theater, and to me, this is a very theatrical movie. It's almost like a piece of theater. Some of that stuff you're talking about with the style of acting, it's almost Shakespearean at times. It feels like a Shakespeare play, and I mean, just having death on stage as a character or on screen as a character, like that's very theatrical. And there's not a lot of special effects. It's all just kind of the acting, and it's fairly low budget as well. But yeah, it always felt very theatrical to me, and having that kind of not quite realism, that just fits in with that. Um, yeah, it just always struck me that way, that he's coming from theater and he's kind of creating this film, which is almost like theater in a way. And I mean, there's a theatrical troupe in this movie, right? There's a group of actors who travel around and we see them performing. And so there's very much theater within theater going on here as well. Not to mention the whole religious, when they come marching through and they have these rituals, and it's all, a friend of mine actually majored in religious studies, and I was doing theater at the time, and he said, well, religion is just kind of theater that some people take too seriously. And so I think in a way, the religious stuff you see here is very theatrical, and that's part of it too, is the religious characters, in a way, they don't even believe what they're saying. They're kind of phonies, and they kind of accuse them of, you sent us out on these crusades, but it was all kind of bullshit or whatever. Like it's there's definitely, I feel it's kind of an religious film in a way. It's certainly an existential film, looking at what is the meaning of things, and the knight trying to find meaning and trying to figure out the answers, but wanting to believe in a god, but not seeing any evidence of it, and looking everywhere. And not even death can give him any answers about that. Death is just this strictly neutral figure that doesn't know anything. So, anyway, that appealed to me too when I was young. I think that sort of anti-religious, um, you know, life has no meaning kind of a point of view.
I think this movie is all of those things, depending on the point of view character that you're looking at. I think the knight is clearly the character that questions everything. And he represents, the Crusades and all of that stuff. And you have the squire that is clearly an atheist. He doesn't believe in anything. He's just carefree, whatever. Just live life to the fullest. When you're dead, you're dead. And then you have the actor who clearly believes. That's the only reason I wouldn't say it's completely anti-religious, because he's the character that lives. He's the only one that sees death except the knight, and he's the character that lives, and he sees them at the end in that iconic scene. Two things this movie is known for is the main theme of the chess game, but also that iconic ending where they're all following death and they're doing that death dance. He sees that. You do have the character who truly believes through the plague, through the witch hunt, through the Crusades, through all of these reasons not to believe. The person with the most faith is the character that lives. So I don't think it's completely anti-religious. I think each character represents Bergman in a different point of view or different points in his life. Obviously, he made this at a specific point, but I think he gives each of them fair representation of why each character feels the way they do. So I think it's fairly even-handed with the approach. All three of these historically terrible things going on at the same time, it's kind of hard to keep your faith, It's like, because we do see someone we don't see them, but we see someone get burnt at the stake. We see someone die of the plague. So we do see all of these terrible things happening in front of us. So it's kind of, it's excusable that these characters would feel that way, especially since these three things never happened at the same time anyway. Imagine if they did happen at the same time, Imagine if you got the Crusades and the plague and the witch hunting, and it's just crazy. That's a lot of terrible shit. We just had COVID and we couldn't take it. It's a lot of stuff to deal with. So I do think it's, from that standpoint, is fairly even-handed, and I do think these are themes. I know you said you haven't seen a lot of his movies that permeate his films. You haven't seen have you seen The Virgin Spring?
I don't think so, no.
Okay. That was remade into, is it The Last House on the Left?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So I've seen that.
Yeah. So you've essentially seen The Virgin Spring. But Last House on the Left is just a complete horror film. The Virgin Spring is, again, something that deals with religion, where the virgin daughter is raped and killed. And here's this religious man having these people here that he realized did this to his daughter. How does he handle that with his faith and revenge and all of those heavy elements? So these are, I think, because he had a religious background or a family that was super religious that tried to bring him into it. He had all of these like heavy questions, like, what does believing in God mean? What does that entail? How does that affect your life? Well, what if these scenarios happened? I think he's a director that had these questions in his mind, and they're morbid questions, really. It's like, these are morbid things, that he's dealing with when you talk about these themes in these movies. Do you imagine him as like a 7-year-old kid in church thinking like, man, if God is real, what if my sister was raped and killed? What would my dad do? Like, would he just like have faith in God and let God deal with it, or would he deal with it himself? I'm not saying that's what he's thinking as a kid, but you can imagine at some point in his life, all of these thoughts permeating through his head as he's dealing with religion firsthand. For myself, I'm not religious at all. I'm glad my mother never put religion on me. She never forced it on me. I'm the atheist in the group as far as the trio.
Yeah. Well, I'm the same way. I grew up with no religion at all. Like, neither of my parents were into it. They came from different backgrounds. So, there wasn't even, if they were going to have religion, which one would it be, and there just never was any. We just never had it. And so to me, it was always strange when other people had it in a very strong way. I just didn't get that. But I think I had friends who very much came from a religious background and then were kind of questioning it and maybe even rejecting it. And they were, in some cases, writing songs and some really powerful stuff was coming from them, which I really liked. Where they were kind of questioning that whole thing, and in a way, that religious background gave them a lot of fodder to work with when they were creating their art. So I don't know a lot about Bergman, but I gather, that was the same for him, that he had a lot of baggage from some, experiences perhaps in the past with religious leaders or family or whoever, that, he didn't think this was cool. And so he kind of portrayed it in his films, showing it kind of in a negative light. But I was going to say before, I called it anti-religious, but ultimately at the end, I kind of go, well, is it anti-religious or is it kind of strangely religious? Which one is it?
Mhm.
I'm not sure. The one of the final lines of the film is apparently something that Jesus apparently said on the cross. Uh, one of the things that he supposedly said. That's what the character, the mute woman, she speaks that line at the very end, and it's
Mhm.
quoting Jesus. So I mean, it's a strangely religious thing to do, right? If it's a completely anti-religious film, um, yeah. So it's interesting in that way, but certainly there's a lot in there that somebody who is an atheist or is kind of agnostic, you can kind of look, yeah, okay, here's some evidence, right? You've got the witch who believes that she's in league with Satan or with the devil, and then in the end she kind of gets nothing from him, and maybe realizes that it was all a lie, or whatever. And so to me, that was a powerful moment, and it really stuck with me.
There are a lot of powerful moments in this movie. That's when you really realize what a craftsman Bergman is. Here's this big speech, here's this great moment that you have to pay attention to. Like everything is leading up to this. He kind of let the movie play out subtly, just asking questions, just pondering things. That's why I think the point of view of the knight is the most interesting one, because everyone else accepts their fate. The atheist, he just doesn't believe. He's just going to live his life to the fullest. The believer is like, when I die, God is going to take care of me. So it's like you kind of have your perspective. You do have the witch that burns, where at the end she kind of says, "Uh-oh," like,
Yeah.
wait a minute, But I
Yeah.
think that's all of us. That's all of us.
Yeah.
Even all of them at the end, when death came for them, they were all kind of like, "Uh-oh." Towards the end, you're going to have that with everyone. No one wants to die naturally. But as far as the way they lived their lives, they kind of committed to where they were, and there was no worry. The only one that worried and stressed and contemplated everything was the person who just open to listening to all the points of view. The knight wanted to hear the point of view of the witch. He wanted to understand where she was coming from and understand her point of view. He wanted to understand the point of view of the actor who believed, and of his squire as well. He went to the church and obviously was tricked by death, giving out his plan to win the game, but he spoke to death too. Like he really questioned and he tried to understand everyone's point of view. And that was the person that was the most stressed, because he understood the weight of everything. And I think ignorance is bliss. If you just fully commit to something without being open-minded, you're just committed to that thing. And the person that stresses out the most, I guess, is the person that puts the most thought into all aspects of it.
Yeah, for sure. And I think one of the keys is that he really wants to believe. He wants to believe in this. And he
Mm-hmm.
just spent 10 years of his life in the Crusades, which means he's fighting for religion, right? He's fighting for Christianity and spreading Christianity, but he doesn't quite believe. He kind of wants to believe. He wants some evidence, and so that makes it all the more powerful that he's looking for answers and he can't find them. And he does say that he wants to do one good thing or one meaningful thing before he dies, right? He's delaying death by playing chess, and he hopes to do one thing. And I don't know. Do you think he does? Does he achieve one thing in this
Well,
movie?
he saves the actor and the wife and the kid when he
Yeah.
knocks over the chessboard and he
Well,
starts
yeah,
smiling,
yeah.
and Beth is like, "What are you
That's
smiling for?" Yeah.
yeah. That's the only thing. Like it could be
Yeah.
that. That could be his one thing. It's very subtle, though.
Bergman doesn't play it up. He doesn't
Yeah.
like the music doesn't start swelling when he knocks over the chessboard. You know, he just kind
No,
of let the scenes play as they
yeah,
are.
and you can just take it as I'm mad that I'm losing the game and I'm
Mhm.
knocking it over. I'm trying to delay the game, um, but yeah, it could be that he's giving them their chance to exit, and it does work in that
Mhm.
way. So yeah, it's I was left wondering, well, was that his intention? Did he
Mhm.
actually think this is my one good moment here, or did it just kind of happen? Um, I
Yeah.
don't know that it's 100% clear, but I'll take it.
That's what great filmmakers do. They let you interpret things. They don't think for you. They just put the scenario in front of you and let you decide. I definitely see where you're coming from when you think it's a bleak film. The person who believed did live at the end, so he did give you something to hold on
Hmm.
to. But ultimately, the only thing that's clear is death.
Yeah,
There was no sign of the devil, there was no sign of God. You can
yeah,
say, yes, the person who believed in religion lived because there is a God, or you can say they lived because that was his one good thing the knight wanted to do before he died. And
yeah,
that was just between him and death. It wasn't between him and a God, it was just between him
yeah,
and death. It's understandable why it's analyzed so much. It's historic, it's great, it's worth watching. I watched this two ways. I watched this with subtitles and I watched this dubbed. Definitely a different experience
oh yeah,
because that's why I talked about the dialogue initially. The dialogue comes off better when you're reading it because it's very artistic dialogue. But then when you're hearing it dubbed and you understand what the actors are saying, it doesn't come off realistic. It comes off a
yeah,
little dated, a little stagey, a little
yeah,
unrealistic. It takes you out of it a little bit because it's like people don't talk like this. Either way, I mean, it's a great film, but as far as the viewing wise, I would definitely suggest watching it with subtitles.
yeah. That's the only way I did watch it. I have this I have this DVD here, and
Mhm.
it does have both. Like I could have watched it with the dubbing, and maybe I should have out of curiosity. Was it the same? Like, was the dubbed line identical to the subtitle, or
No,
were they?
no,
No.
it's a little bit
Yeah,
different. Yeah.
yeah. Because I there were times I've done that where I put on both, and I wind up having to turn one of them off because they're so different. In some
Yeah.
cases, it's like
Yeah.
that's not even the same thing. Like, what's going on here? Like two very different translations. So
The dubbing wasn't as poetic.
yeah,
There were certain lines I'm like, wait a minute, seems kind of flat. Then I
yeah.
just switch back on the subtitles, be like, oh, that sounds so much more poetic. You know, it's like
Yeah, well, I guess part of the issue is when you're dubbing, you're trying to match the lips a little bit. So
you're trying to match the
you
lips and you're maybe they're trying to make it sound a little bit more realistic how people would talk,
yeah.
maybe.
And of course, there's also the issue if it's not the original actor doing the dubbing, then you may have somebody who's not as good, who
Mhm.
doesn't know the part, and is just saying the lines, so it's not coming out with the right emotion or the right intention behind it. So yeah, dubbing can be
It's
iffy.
very tricky when you watch a foreign film because
Yeah,
there's no right answer. I mean, because when
no,
you're reading it, you're not paying as much attention to the visuals. You are hearing the actor's performance, but you don't know the nuances of that culture and how the acting, like there are certain nuances that American actors do that as American you can say, oh, you can really appreciate that nuance. But when you're unfamiliar with the culture and you have an actor who does a lot of nuance type things, they could be completely lost in you because you don't know the culture. So sometimes it might be helpful to have an American actor who reads it with the nuances that you're familiar with. Oh my God, like if I was Japanese, that little subtle thing he does triggers something in me that makes me think, oh man, that's like really authentic.
yeah,
How the fuck would I know what's authentic, you know,
yeah,
in Sweden or Scandinavia, you know? So
yeah.
I don't know.
True. That's true.
Max
Yeah.
von Sydow, I think this was his first film, or at least his first film with Bergman.
Yeah.
Yeah,
He was
early in his
apparently quite
career.
young. He was
Yeah.
quite young, hey, like 26 or 27 or something.
Yeah, he definitely looked older. A
Oh
lot of time.
yeah. I
He has
never
like
would
a
have.
very rigid, hard face. He looks a lot
Yeah.
older.
Yeah.
This is one of the more historic director actor combos. I'll start off, I'll keep the joke going. One of the greatest director actor combos out there is Orson Welles, the director, and Orson Welles, the actor. Bringing that whole thing full circle. Scorsese and De Niro and
Mhm.
Kurosawa and Mifune, however you pronounce Toshiro's last name. You have a lot of these great combos out there, and this is definitely one of the great combos.
For sure. And of course, he went on to become quite a big star in lots of movies, not just in Sweden, but all over.
Yeah, The Exorcist, a lot of great American
Yes,
movies as well. Yeah.
yes, yeah, absolutely. So I think it's a great film. I enjoyed it. I guess we didn't say, but it's, I emphasize the darkness and I like the darkness of it, but it's actually also funny at times. It's got comedic scenes. It has all the tones, really. It's not just dark.
Yeah, I was surprised how many times they went for jokes, but I guess you
Yeah.
have to. Otherwise, it's so bleak. You just get depressed watching it.
Yeah. And interestingly, I didn't remember any of that. I just remember the darkness. I remember the chess game and the witch and stuff like that.
I remember
And I,
the chess game. I remember the scene where he's talking to death, but didn't know he was talking to death and gave away his secrets to win the
yeah,
game. I remember the dancing at the end, but you're right.
yes,
There's so many other things you notice on a second or rewatch. Maybe
yeah,
not even a second rewatch. It might be like my third or fourth time watching it, but a
yeah.
rewatch decades late, at least a decade later. I think this was based on a painting. It's so dense in the visuals and the themes and everything you're watching on screen. Highly recommend.
Yeah, me too. And I didn't when I first saw it, I didn't watch a lot of other Bergman films, but maybe now that I've rewatched it all these years later, maybe this will inspire me to check out some of his other films because I'm sure they're also worth seeing.
I think Wild Strawberries might be better than this. It's been a while
Oh
since
yeah,
I've seen both because it's been years since I've watched his filmography. But I think Wild Strawberries was better than this. And I think Fanny and Alexander is considered his best movie. But that's the one of his movies I didn't watch. I didn't
okay,
watch all of his filmography. I missed that one, but I've heard that one is his best one. And I remember really liking Wild Strawberries. It wasn't as appealing as this. If you see it, you're like, man, I've already seen this a million other times, from other movies that copied it. But he's one
yeah,
of those filmmakers. Other filmmakers study his work and then they go out and make movies.
oh for sure, yeah, absolutely.